The winter wind howled through the gaps in the wooden cabin walls, carrying with it the promise of another harsh night in the Montana wilderness. 8-year-old Emma pressed her small face against the frosted window, watching the snow pile higher against their front door. Her breath created small clouds in the cold air inside their home, a clear sign that the fire had been reduced to mere embers hours ago. Her father, Frank Morrison, sat slumped in his wooden chair near the dying fireplace, an empty bottle clutched in his weathered hands. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, evidence of the weight he had lost over the past months. The smell of stale alcohol mixed with unwashed clothing filled the small space, making Emma wrinkle her nose as she turned away from the window. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind outside. "I'm hungry." Frank's bloodshot eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty on his daughter's pale face. Dark circles under her eyes made her look much older than her 8 years, and her clothes, once a cheerful blue dress, now appeared several sizes too large for her shrinking frame. "There ain't nothing left, girl," Frank mumbled, his words slurred from the effects of his last drink. "Ate the last of the beans yesterday." Emma's stomach cramped painfully, reminding her that yesterday's meager portion of beans had been her only meal in 2 days. She had grown accustomed to the constant gnawing hunger, but tonight it seemed worse than usual. The cold made everything worse. "Maybe we could ask someone for help," Emma suggested quietly, knowing that her father's pride would likely reject the idea before she finished speaking. "We don't take charity from nobody," Frank snapped, his voice gaining strength from his anger. "Morrison family takes care of their own." But as Emma looked around their one-room cabin, she saw little evidence of anyone taking care of anything. Dirty dishes sat piled in a wooden bucket, frozen solid from the cold. Their small supply of firewood had dwindled to nothing, leaving them dependent on the few twigs and branches Emma could gather during her brief ventures outside. The truth was that Frank Morrison had once been a different man. Before his wife Margaret had died from fever 3 winters ago, he had been a capable hunter and trapper, providing well for his small family. Their cabin had been warm and filled with the smell of Margaret's cooking, and Emma's laughter had echoed through the rooms as she played with the wooden dolls her father had carved for her. Everything changed after Margaret's death. Frank had turned to whiskey to numb his grief, spending what little money they had on bottles instead of food or supplies. His hunting skills, once sharp enough to track deer through the densest forest, had deteriorated along with his sobriety. Many nights he would stumble home empty-handed, cursing the animals that seemed to have vanished from the woods. Emma had learned to stay quiet during these episodes, understanding somehow that her father's anger was not really directed at her, but at the cruel world that had taken away the woman they both loved. She missed her mother desperately, especially during moments like these when the cold and hunger seemed overwhelming. As the night grew darker, Emma wrapped herself in the thin blanket that served as her only protection against the freezing temperature. She curled up on the wooden cot that had been her bed for as long as she could remember, trying to find a position that would stop her stomach from cramping. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sound of movement in the cabin next to theirs. The old Native American man who lived there, whom the townspeople called Modoc, had been their neighbor for several years, though Frank had always kept his distance. Emma had occasionally seen him during her wood-gathering expeditions, noting how he moved quietly through the forest and always seemed to have enough firewood stacked neatly beside his home. Her mother had always spoken kindly of Modoc, mentioning how he had helped them during their first winter in the territory by sharing knowledge about which plants were safe to eat and how to preserve meat for the long cold months. But since Margaret's death, Frank had become suspicious of everyone, including their helpful neighbor. The wind continued to rattle their cabin throughout the night, and Emma dozed fitfully, waking frequently from dreams about warm meals and her mother's gentle voice singing lullabies. Each time she woke, the reality of her situation struck her anew, and she had to fight back tears that she knew would only freeze on her cheeks. When morning finally arrived, bringing with it a pale gray light that filtered through their frost-covered window, Emma realized that something had to change. Her father was still unconscious in his chair, the empty bottle having fallen to the floor sometime during the night. She knew that when he woke he would be angry and sick, demanding the whiskey that they could not afford, and that was slowly killing him. But more importantly, she knew that without food soon, she might not survive another week. The thought scared her, but it also gave her a strange kind of courage. Her mother had always told her that Morrison women were strong, and that strength sometimes meant making difficult decisions. As she sat on her cot, listening to her father's labored breathing and feeling the sharp pangs of hunger in her belly, Emma began to form a plan. She had noticed that Modoc always seemed to have meat hanging outside his cabin, and she had often smelled the rich aroma of cooking venison drifting from his chimney. The question was whether she could find the courage to approach a man her father had always warned her to avoid, and whether her pride would allow her to ask for help that her family desperately needed. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the desperate conditions of their cabin, Emma realized that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and made a decision that would change everything for both her and her father. Today, she would swallow her Morrison pride and ask their neighbor for help. The alternative, she now understood with the clarity that only true desperation could bring, was simply not acceptable. Emma waited until her father's snoring indicated he was deep in his whiskey-induced sleep, before carefully opening the cabin door. The morning air bit at her exposed skin like tiny needles, and she had to squint against the brightness of sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow. Her worn boots crunched softly as she stepped outside, each footstep sinking several inches into the white powder that had accumulated overnight. The distance between their cabin and Modoc's home was only about 50 yards, but to Emma it felt like miles. She had never spoken directly to their neighbor, though she had watched him from afar many times. He was a tall man with long gray hair that he often wore in a single braid down his back, and his face was weathered from years of living in the harsh mountain climate. As she approached his cabin, Emma could see smoke rising steadily from his chimney, and the smell of cooking meat made her stomach clench with desperate hunger. She paused at the edge of his property, suddenly unsure of herself. What if he turned her away? What if her father woke up and found her gone? What if Modoc was as unfriendly as Frank always claimed? Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the door to Modoc's cabin opened and the man himself stepped outside. He was carrying an armload of firewood, but he stopped when he noticed the small figure standing uncertainly in the snow near his home. "Child," he said in a quiet voice that carried clearly in the still morning air, "you are far from your warm bed on such a cold day." Emma found that her voice had abandoned her completely. She stood frozen, staring at this man who had lived so close to them for years but whom she had never really known. His dark eyes were kind, she noticed, not threatening as her father had always suggested. Modoc set down his firewood and walked slowly toward her, moving carefully so as not to frighten her. As he came closer, Emma could see the concern in his expression as he took in her thin frame and the obvious signs of hunger and cold that marked her appearance. "You are Frank Morrison's daughter," he said, and it was a statement rather than a question. "Emma, is that right?" She nodded, still unable to find her voice, but encouraged that he knew her name. "Your mother, she was a good woman," Modoc continued, his voice gentle. "She used to bring me fresh bread sometimes when she was baking. I was sorry when she passed to the spirit world." The mention of her mother brought tears to Emma's eyes, and suddenly the words she had been holding back came tumbling out in a rush. "Papa hasn't been hunting for weeks, and we don't have any food left, and he keeps saying he needs his whiskey, but we don't have money for whiskey or food either. And I'm so hungry I can't sleep. And I don't know what to do because Papa just sits in his chair and drinks when he has whiskey and gets angry when he doesn't have whiskey. And I think maybe we're going to die if something doesn't change soon." The words came out in one long, breathless sentence, and when she finished, Emma realized she was crying. The tears were warm on her cheeks for only a moment before the cold air began to freeze them. Modoc listened to her entire outburst without interruption, nodding slowly as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "This is a hard thing you have told me," he said finally. "A child should not have to carry such worries." He looked toward her family's cabin, where a thin wisp of smoke still rose from the chimney, though Emma knew it was probably just the last of their firewood burning away. "Your father, he has been fighting with grief," Modoc continued. "Sometimes when people lose someone they love very much, they forget how to take care of the ones who are still with them." Emma wiped her nose with the back of her mittened hand, leaving a wet streak across her face. "I tried to tell him we needed food, but he just gets mad and says we don't take charity from anyone." "Pride is important," Modoc agreed. But sometimes pride can become like a trap that keeps us from accepting help we need. He was quiet again for a moment, and Emma could see him thinking carefully about something. The smell of cooking meat continued to drift from his cabin, making her mouth water despite her nervousness. "I have been smoking venison," Modoc said finally. "More than one old man can eat before it spoils. It would be wasteful to let it go bad when there are hungry people nearby." Emma's heart leaped with hope, but then she remembered her father's warnings about accepting charity. "Papa said we don't take handouts from anybody," she said quietly. Modoc smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Emma was surprised to see how his whole face changed when he smiled. "This would not be charity," he said. "This would be neighbors helping neighbors the way your mother used to help me with her bread." He gestured toward his cabin. "Come inside where it is warm, and we will think about how to help your family without hurting your father's pride." Emma hesitated for just a moment, looking back toward her own cabin where her father still slept. Then her stomach cramped again, reminding her of why she had found the courage to make this journey in the first place. She followed Modoc toward his cabin, her boots squeaking in the snow. As they reached his door, he paused and looked down at her seriously. "Emma," he said, "what I am about to share with you must stay between us for now. Your father is not ready to accept help directly, but that does not mean we cannot find ways to help him anyway." Emma nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. All she knew was that for the first time in weeks she felt a small spark of hope warming her chest, fighting back against the cold and hunger that had become her constant companions. The inside of Modoc's cabin was like stepping into a different world. The first thing Emma noticed was the warmth that enveloped her like a gentle embrace, making her realize just how cold she had been for so long. A fire crackled cheerfully in a stone fireplace, and the walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved foods, dried herbs, and various tools she didn't recognize. But what captured her attention most was the sight of strips of dark red meat hanging from wooden racks near the fireplace, filling the air with a rich, smoky aroma that made her mouth water instantly. Her stomach growled loudly in response, and she pressed her hands against it, embarrassed by the sound. "Sit," Modoc said gently, pointing to a chair near the fire. "Warm yourself while I prepare something for your hunger." Emma perched on the edge of the chair, afraid to fully relax in case this was all a dream, and she would wake up back in the cold cabin with her unconscious father. She watched as Modoc moved around his kitchen area with practiced efficiency, cutting off pieces of the smoked venison and placing them on a wooden plate, along with what appeared to be some kind of bread. "This bread is made from acorn flour," he explained as he worked. "Your mother, she was interested in learning how to make it." But his voice trailed off, and Emma understood that her mother's death had interrupted many plans and conversations. When Modoc handed her the plate, Emma had to force herself not to grab the food and devour it immediately. Her mother had taught her manners, even if their current circumstances made such things seem less important than survival. "Eat," Modoc said, settling into a chair across from her. "There is no shame in hunger, only in letting pride prevent us from satisfying it when help is available." The first bite of venison was like a miracle in Emma's mouth. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that reminded her somehow of the forest itself. The acorn bread was different from anything she had ever tasted, with a slightly nutty flavor that complemented the meat perfectly. As she ate, Modoc watched her with a mixture of sadness and concern. "How long since you have had a proper meal?" he asked quietly. Emma had to think about it. "Maybe a week. We had some beans a few days ago, but before that." She shrugged, unable to remember exactly when she had last felt truly full. "And your father? He doesn't eat much anymore. He says the whiskey keeps him from getting hungry, but I think he's getting thinner too." Modoc nodded thoughtfully. "Grief affects people in different ways. Some people stop eating, some people eat too much, some people drink to forget their pain." "Did you know my mama well?" Emma asked between bites, curious about this man who seemed to understand so much about their family's situation. "Margaret was a wise woman," Modoc replied. "She understood that survival in this place requires cooperation. When I first moved here, she brought me soup when I was sick with fever. She never asked for anything in return, but when your family needed help learning which plants were safe to gather, I was happy to share that knowledge." Emma could picture her mother doing exactly that, carrying a pot of hot soup through the snow to help a neighbor in need. It made her chest ache with missing her. She would be worried about both you and your father now, Modoc continued. She would want to see you fed and warm and safe. But Papa says we can't take charity, Emma repeated, though the words sounded weaker now that her stomach was beginning to feel satisfied for the first time in days. Then we must find a way to help that does not feel like charity to him, Modoc said. Your father was once a skilled hunter, before grief clouded his mind. Perhaps what he needs is not charity but opportunity. Emma looked at him curiously, not understanding what he meant. Modoc stood and walked to one of his shelves, returning with a small leather pouch that jingled softly when he moved it. I have been saving money to buy supplies in town, but winter travel is difficult for an old man. If someone were willing to make the journey for me, to purchase the things I need, I would be happy to pay them for their time and effort. Emma's eyes widened as she began to understand his plan. You want Papa to go to town for you? It would be honest work, Modoc said. Your father could buy supplies for me and I could pay him fair wages for the service. With that money he could buy food and whatever else your family needs. But what if he says no? Emma asked, though hope was beginning to bloom in her chest. Then we will think of another way, Modoc replied simply. There is always another way when people are willing to help each other. Emma finished the last bite of bread and venison, feeling more satisfied than she had in weeks. But even as her physical hunger was relieved, she found herself hungry for something else, something harder to define. She was hungry for the feeling of safety she remembered from when her mother was alive. Hungry for the sound of her father's laughter, hungry for the warmth of a family that functioned the way families were supposed to. Will you really help us? She asked quietly, afraid that speaking the words aloud might somehow break the spell of this warm cabin and kind man. Child, Modoc said, his voice serious but gentle. Your mother helped me when I needed it most. Now it is my turn to help her daughter. This is how communities survive in hard places like this, by taking care of each other. Emma felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things might get better. What do I tell Papa? She asked. Tell him that your neighbor has a business proposition for him, Modoc said. Tell him that it is honest work for honest pay, and that you believe your mother would want him to consider it. Emma nodded, already planning how she would approach her father when he woke up. The conversation would not be easy, but for the first time in months she felt like she had something hopeful to offer him, instead of just another reminder of their desperate situation. When Emma returned to their cabin, she found her father exactly as she had left him, slumped in his chair with dried drool on his chin and his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the same position all night. The fire had died completely while she was gone, leaving the cabin almost as cold inside as it was outside. Her breath still formed small clouds in the air, but somehow the cold didn't feel as threatening as it had earlier that morning. She busied herself trying to restart the fire with the few remaining twigs and wood shavings scattered around their fireplace, working quietly so as not to wake Frank before she was ready to talk to him. The warmth and food from Modoc's cabin had given her strength, but she knew the conversation ahead would require all the courage she could muster. Frank began to stir as the small fire started to catch, probably awakened by the crackling sounds and the first hints of warmth beginning to spread through the room. He opened his eyes slowly, wincing as the movement caused his head to pound from the after-effects of the previous night's drinking. Emma, he called out, his voice hoarse and confused. Where have you been, girl? I went outside to look for firewood, Papa, Emma said, which was not entirely a lie since she had been thinking about their need for firewood during her visit with Modoc. Frank tried to sit up straighter in his chair, but the movement made him groan and press one hand to his temple. My head feels like it's being split with an axe, he muttered. Emma had seen him like this many times before, sick and shaky the morning after drinking. She knew he would be irritable and difficult to reason with until the worst of the sickness passed, but she also knew this might be her only opportunity to catch him when he wasn't actively drinking. Papa, she said carefully, continuing to tend the small fire. I saw our neighbor this morning, Modoc. Frank's reaction was immediate and predictable. I told you to stay away from that old Indian, he snapped, his voice gaining strength from his anger. Nothing good comes from getting mixed up with his kind. He seemed nice. Papa, he asked about Mama. The mention of Margaret seemed to deflate some of Frank's anger, replacing it with the familiar sadness that always accompanied any discussion of his late wife. "Your mama was too trusting," he said quietly. "Always wanting to help everybody, never thinking about the danger." Emma turned away from the fire to face her father directly. She could see how thin he had become, how his clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame, and how his hands shook slightly as he tried to smooth down his disheveled hair. The sight strengthened her resolve. "Papa, we need food," she said simply. "And Modoc said he has a job offer for you." "I don't want his charity," Frank replied automatically. But Emma noticed that he didn't reject the idea immediately the way she had expected. "It's not charity," Emma said, repeating Modoc's words. "He needs someone to go to town for him, to buy supplies he can't get himself because the winter travel is too hard for an old man. He said he would pay fair wages for honest work." Frank was quiet for a long moment considering this information. Emma could see him struggling between his pride and his practical understanding of their desperate situation. "What kind of supplies?" he asked finally. "I don't know exactly," Emma admitted, "but he has money to pay for the trip, and he said the work would be worth enough to help us buy food and other things we need." Frank stood up slowly, swaying slightly as his balance adjusted to being upright. He walked to the window and looked out toward Modoc's cabin, where smoke continued to rise steadily from the chimney. "I used to be a good provider," he said, speaking more to himself than to Emma. "Before your mama died, we never went hungry. We had everything we needed." "You're still a good papa," Emma said softly. "You're just sad, and sad people sometimes need help remembering how to take care of things." Frank turned to look at his daughter, really seeing her for the first time in weeks. He noticed how pale she had become, how her dress hung loose on her small frame, how her eyes seemed too large for her thin face. The sight of her condition hit him like a physical blow. "How long since you had a proper meal?" he asked, echoing the question Modoc had asked earlier. "It's been a while, Papa," Emma said gently, not wanting to make him feel worse than he already did. Frank closed his eyes and leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by the realization of how badly he had been failing in his responsibilities as a father. "Your mama would be ashamed of me," he whispered. "No, Papa," Emma said firmly. "Mama would understand that you're hurting, and she would want you to accept help when it's offered." Frank was quiet for several minutes, wrestling with emotions he had been trying to drown in whiskey for months. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at his daughter again. "This neighbor of ours," he said slowly. "Did he say when he needed this trip to town?" Emma's heart leaped with hope. "He said he's been waiting for the right person to help him, someone he could trust to handle his business properly. And he really said he would pay fair wages." "He did, Papa. He said it was honest work for honest pay." Frank nodded slowly, and Emma could see him making a decision. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to talk to him about it," he said finally, "to hear what exactly he needs done." Emma wanted to jump up and hug him, but she forced herself to remain calm. She could see that her father was still fragile, still struggling with his pride and his grief, and she didn't want to do anything that might cause him to change his mind. "Should I tell him you'll come talk to him today?" she asked. Frank looked around their empty cabin, taking in the lack of food, the dying fire, and the general state of poverty that surrounded them. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tell him I'll come by this afternoon when I'm feeling more myself." Emma nodded, already planning her return trip to Modoc's cabin. For the first time in months, she felt like her family might have a real chance at getting back on their feet. That afternoon, Emma watched nervously from their cabin window as her father made his way through the snow toward Modoc's home. Frank had spent the morning cleaning himself up as best he could, washing his face with cold water from their bucket, and trying to smooth his hair into something resembling respectability. He had also spent considerable time pacing around their small cabin, muttering to himself about pride and necessity, and what Margaret would have wanted him to do. Emma could see the tension in her father's shoulders as he knocked on Modoc's door, and she held her breath until the door opened and both men disappeared inside. Then she settled down to wait, trying to keep herself busy by organizing their few remaining possessions while straining to hear any sounds from the neighboring cabin. Inside Modoc's warm home, Frank found himself in an awkward position. He had spent years avoiding his neighbor, convinced by his own prejudices and the influence of whiskey that the old Native American man was somehow dangerous or untrustworthy. Now, sitting across from Modoc at a sturdy wooden table, Frank was forced to confront the reality that his neighbor lived in obvious comfort and security, while his own family was starving. "Your daughter tells me you might be interested in doing some business," Modoc said without preamble, gesturing for Frank to sit down. "Maybe," Frank replied cautiously. "Depends on what kind of business you're talking about." Modoc poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm near the fire, and the rich aroma made Frank's stomach clench with hunger. He couldn't remember the last time he had tasted real coffee. "I need someone to make a trip to Missoula," Modoc explained, sliding one of the cups across the table to Frank. "There are supplies I require that cannot be obtained locally, and the winter journey is becoming too difficult for these old bones." Frank wrapped his hands around the warm cup, grateful for both the heat and the caffeine. "What kind of supplies?" "Medical herbs that I cannot gather myself in winter, tools for working leather, some special items for traditional crafts," Modoc said. "I have a detailed list and I have the money to pay for everything plus your wages for making the trip." "How much are we talking about?" Frank asked, trying to sound businesslike rather than desperate. "The round trip should take about a week, depending on weather," Modoc replied. "I was thinking $50 for your time and effort, plus money for your supplies while you're traveling." Frank nearly choked on his coffee. $50 was more money than he had seen in months, enough to buy food and whiskey and maybe even some warmer clothes for Emma. But something in Modoc's calm expression made him suspicious. "That's a lot of money for a simple supply run," Frank said carefully. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Modoc replied. "Just honest work for honest pay, as I told your daughter." Frank studied the older man's face, looking for signs of deception or pity, but found neither. "Why me?" he asked finally. "There must be other men in town who could make this trip." "There are," Modoc agreed. "But most of them charge too much or cannot be trusted to handle business properly. You, despite your recent struggles, have a reputation for being reliable when you are sober." The words stung, but Frank recognized the truth in them. Before Margaret's death, he had indeed been known as a man who kept his word and completed any job he took on. "I haven't been sober much lately," Frank admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "I am aware of that," Modoc said gently, "but I am also aware that grief makes people do things they would not normally do. The question is whether you are ready to start taking care of your responsibilities again." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup and thinking about Emma's thin face and empty stomach. "If I took this job," he said slowly, "when would you need me to leave?" "As soon as you are ready. The sooner the better, actually, since winter weather can change quickly and make travel dangerous." "And you'd really pay $50? "I would pay $50 for the job done properly," Modoc confirmed. "But Frank, I need to know that you will stay sober during this trip. My business requires someone I can trust completely." Frank felt a familiar craving for whiskey at the mention of staying sober, but the thought of Emma's hungry face gave him strength to push the feeling aside. "I can stay sober for a week," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Then we have an agreement," Modoc said, extending his hand across the table. Frank hesitated for just a moment before reaching out to shake the offered hand. "When do I get the list and the money?" "The list I can give you now," Modoc said, standing and walking to a shelf where he retrieved a piece of paper covered with neat handwriting. "The money for supplies I will give you tomorrow morning, along with your advance payment. The rest of your wages you will receive when you return with everything on the list." Frank looked at the paper, noting that the items were indeed legitimate supplies, not the kind of things that would involve him in anything illegal or questionable. "This all looks straightforward enough," he said. "It is," Modoc assured him. "I am not interested in complications, only in getting the things I need." As Frank prepared to leave, Modoc stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Frank," he said seriously, "your daughter is a good child, but she is too thin and too worried for someone her age. This job could help you take better care of her, but only if you commit to staying away from the bottle." Frank's jaw tightened at the criticism, but he forced himself to nod. "I know what my responsibilities are," he said. "I hope so," Modoc replied. "Because that little girl needs her father to be the man he used to be, not the man he has become." The words followed Frank back to his own cabin, where Emma waited anxiously for news of the meeting. When he told her about the job offer and the money involved, her face lit up with the first genuine smile he had seen from her in months. $50, Papa. Really? Really, Frank confirmed. Enough to buy food and supplies and maybe even some warmer clothes for you. Emma threw her arms around her father's waist, hugging him tightly. I knew you could take care of us, Papa. I knew you just needed the right opportunity. Frank hugged her back, feeling both hope and terror at the thought of the commitment he had just made. He would have to stay sober for an entire week, travel through dangerous winter conditions, and handle someone else's money and business responsibly. It had been months since he had done anything that required that level of focus and self-control. But as he held his daughter and felt how thin she had become, Frank knew he had to try. For Emma's sake, and for the memory of the man Margaret had married, he had to find the strength to be reliable again. The next morning brought the most difficult test of Frank's resolve. As he prepared for the journey to Missoula, his hands shook not from the cold but from the desperate craving for whiskey that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. He had managed to stay sober for one full day, but the thought of a week-long trip without alcohol filled him with anxiety that made his stomach churn and his palms sweat. Emma watched her father pack his few belongings into a worn leather satchel, noting how his hands trembled as he folded his extra shirt. She had heard him pacing the floor most of the night, muttering to himself and occasionally stopping to stare longingly at the empty whiskey bottles that still sat on their shelf, like mocking reminders of easier times. Papa, she said quietly, are you sure you're ready for this trip? Frank paused in his packing and looked at his daughter. Dark circles under his eyes showed how little sleep he had gotten, and she could see the internal struggle written clearly on his haggard face. I have to be ready, he said simply. We don't have any other choice. A knock at their door interrupted the conversation, and Frank opened it to find Modoc standing outside with a small leather pouch in his hand. The older man's sharp eyes took in Frank's obvious distress, but he said nothing about it. The money for supplies and your advance payment, Modoc said, holding out the pouch. Everything is counted exactly. The supply money is in the larger compartment. Your advance is in the smaller one. Frank took the pouch with hands that shook slightly, feeling the weight of more money than he had held in months. The leather was warm from Modoc's hands, and Frank could hear the coins jingling softly inside. For a brief moment, his mind calculated how much whiskey that money could buy, and he had to force himself to push the thought away. There's something else, Modoc continued, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small wrapped bundle. Food for your journey. Smoked meat and trail bread that will keep well in the cold. The smell of the food made Emma's stomach growl audibly, and Frank felt another wave of shame at how poorly he had been providing for his daughter. Thank you, he said stiffly, not comfortable with accepting what felt like charity but knowing he had little choice. Frank, Modoc said seriously, I want you to understand something. This money represents months of my savings. I am trusting you not just with my business, but with my ability to survive the rest of this winter. Do not make me regret that trust. The weight of responsibility settled on Frank's shoulders like a heavy blanket. I won't let you down, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. See that you don't, Modoc replied. Then more gently he added, Your daughter will be welcome at my cabin while you are gone if she needs anything. Frank's pride bristled at the suggestion, but Emma spoke up before he could object. Thank you, Mr. Modoc. That's very kind of you. After Modoc left, Frank finished his preparations while Emma heated some of the trail food for their breakfast. The smoked meat was rich and flavorful, and Frank found that eating actual food helped steady his nerves somewhat, though the craving for alcohol remained a constant presence in his mind. Papa, Emma said as they ate, what will you do if you really want a drink while you're in town? The question caught Frank off guard with its directness. He had been trying not to think about the saloons and taverns that would be readily available in Missoula, or about how easy it would be to spend Modoc's money on whiskey instead of supplies. I'll remember why I'm making this trip, he said finally. I'll remember that you're counting on me to come back with money for food. Emma nodded, but Frank could see the worry in her eyes. She was too young to have to wonder whether her father would choose alcohol over his responsibilities, but their recent history had taught her to be cautious about trusting his promises. As Frank prepared to leave, he knelt down in front of Emma and took her small hands in his larger ones. I'm going to do this right, he told her. I'm going to stay sober, buy everything on Modoc's list, and come back with enough money to keep us fed for months. I believe you, Papa, Emma said. though he could hear the uncertainty beneath her words. Frank stood and shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of the supply money and his own promise. As he walked toward the door, Emma called out to him, "Papa, wait." She ran to their shelf and picked up one of the empty whiskey bottles, carrying it back to him. "Take this with you." Frank stared at the bottle in confusion. "Why would I want to take an empty whiskey bottle?" "Fill it with water," Emma said simply. "Whenever you want a drink, drink water instead. Mama used to say that sometimes our bodies think they want one thing when they really need something else." The simple wisdom of her suggestion struck Frank like a physical blow. His 8-year-old daughter was trying to help him stay sober, offering strategies for dealing with his addiction because she understood better than he wanted to admit how serious the problem had become. "That's a good idea," he said quietly, taking the bottle from her. "A very good idea." Frank left their cabin with Emma's suggestion echoing in his mind and Modoc's money heavy in his pocket. The journey to Missoula would normally take 3 days of steady travel, but winter conditions might slow him down. Every step away from home would be a test of his resolve, every mile a choice between the man he had been and the man he needed to become. Behind him, Emma stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. Then she closed the door and began counting the hours until his return, praying to her mother's memory that this time, her father would find the strength to keep his promises. The first day of travel was the hardest. Frank's body screamed for alcohol, and his mind invented countless excuses for why stopping at a tavern would be acceptable. But each time the craving became overwhelming, he would take out the empty whiskey bottle now filled with water and force himself to drink deeply while thinking about Emma's trusting face and Modoc's faith in his ability to complete the job. By the second day, as he made steady progress through the snow-covered wilderness toward Missoula, Frank began to feel something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose and the faint stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to being the man his wife had married and his daughter deserved. 6 days later, Emma was helping Modoc stack firewood when they heard the sound of approaching footsteps crunching through the snow. She looked up hopefully, her heart racing with the possibility that her father had returned safely from his journey. When Frank's familiar figure came into view through the trees, carrying a large pack and walking with more purpose than she had seen from him in months, Emma dropped the wood she was holding and ran toward him. "Papa, you came back," she called out, throwing herself into his arms. Frank caught her and lifted her off the ground, spinning her around once before setting her down. Emma immediately noticed differences in him that went beyond the obvious fact that he was sober. His eyes were clearer than they had been in months. His posture was straighter, and there was something in his expression that reminded her of the father she remembered from before her mother's death. "Did you get everything on the list?" she asked eagerly. "Everything and more," Frank replied, shouldering his pack. "And I brought back something special for you, too." Modoc approached them with a slight smile, clearly pleased to see Frank returned safely. "You made good time," he observed. "I was expecting you back tomorrow at the earliest." "Good weather and motivation," Frank replied. "I was anxious to get home to Emma." They made their way to Modoc's cabin, where Frank carefully unpacked all the supplies he had purchased in Missoula. Each item was exactly as specified on the list, and several were of higher quality than Modoc had expected. The medical herbs were fresh and properly preserved, the leather-working tools were well made, and the special items for traditional crafts were precisely what Modoc had requested. "You did excellent work," Modoc said, examining each item carefully. "Better than I had hoped for." Frank reached into his pack and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. "The shopkeeper threw in some extra herbs when I explained they were for winter medicine. Said a man taking care of his neighbors deserved good quality supplies." Modoc raised an eyebrow at this comment but said nothing about Frank's apparent change in perspective regarding neighborly relationships and, "I have something for you too, Emma," Frank said, turning to his daughter with a package wrapped in brown paper. Emma opened it carefully and gasped when she saw what was inside. It was a warm winter coat, sized perfectly for her, made of thick wool in a deep blue color that matched her eyes. Along with the coat was a matching hat and a pair of sturdy mittens. "Papa, it's beautiful," Emma exclaimed, immediately putting on the coat and finding that it fit perfectly. "But how did you afford it?" "The shopkeeper's wife had a daughter about your age who had outgrown her winter clothes," Frank explained. "When I told her about you, she offered to sell them to me for less than half what new ones would cost." Said every child deserves to be warm in winter. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a pouch of money, handing it to Modoc. Your change from the supply purchases, plus I negotiated better prices on several items, so there's more left over than expected. Modoc opened the pouch and counted the money, his eyebrows rising in surprise. This is considerably more than I anticipated. You must have been very persuasive with the merchants. Sober negotiations work better than drunk ones, Frank said with a slight smile. Who would have thought? Emma noticed that her father seemed different in ways that went beyond just not drinking. There was a confidence in his voice that had been missing for months, and he stood straighter, as if he was proud of what he had accomplished. There's more, Frank continued, pulling out another smaller pouch. My wages, as promised, plus a bonus that one of the merchants gave me for helping him reorganize his stockroom while I was waiting for some special orders. Frank handed the money to Emma. This is for our household expenses, food, firewood, and anything else we need to get through the rest of the winter. Emma stared at the money in her hands, more than she had ever seen at one time. Papa, are you sure you don't want to keep some of it? For what? Frank asked. For whiskey? I spent 6 days discovering that I can function just fine without it. Better than fine, actually. Modoc watched this exchange with approval, but then his expression became more serious. Frank, I am glad the trip went well, but I need to ask you something important. What will you do now? How will you keep yourself busy and sober when this job is finished? It was a question Frank had been thinking about during his journey home. I've been considering that, he said. In Missoula, I met a man who runs a freight business. He mentioned that he's always looking for reliable drivers, especially during winter when the work is more dangerous and many men won't take the jobs. Emma's face fell slightly at the thought of her father leaving again so soon, but Frank noticed her expression and knelt down beside her. It would mean more trips away from home, he said gently, but shorter ones and regular work with steady pay. And Emma, I promise you this, I will never again let you go hungry or cold while I'm drowning my sorrows in a bottle. But what if you get sad again? Emma asked quietly. What if you miss Mama so much that you forget about taking care of me? Frank was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. I will always miss your Mama, he said finally, every day for the rest of my life. But I realized something during this trip. Your Mama wouldn't want me to honor her memory by neglecting you. She would want me to take care of you the way she would have, and that means staying sober and being responsible. Modoc cleared his throat gently. If I may, he said, I have a suggestion. Frank, your hunting skills were once excellent before grief interfered with your focus. Winter hunting is difficult, but spring will come, and there will be opportunities to provide for your family and perhaps even to sell surplus meat to others. You're right, Frank agreed. I used to be a good hunter. Maybe I can be again. Emma looked between her father and Modoc, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her new coat. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like her family might actually have a future worth looking forward to. Papa, she said quietly, I'm proud of you. Frank felt tears prick at his eyes as he hugged his daughter close. I'm going to make you proud every day from now on, he promised, starting with keeping my promise to stay sober. As they prepared to return to their own cabin, Modoc called out to them. Frank, Emma, you are always welcome here. Neighbors should help neighbors, especially during the hard times. Frank turned back and extended his hand to the older man. Thank you, he said simply, for the job, for the faith you showed in me, and for taking care of Emma when I wasn't capable of doing it myself. Thank you for proving that faith was justified, Modoc replied, shaking Frank's hand firmly. That evening in their own cabin, Emma and Frank shared a real meal for the first time in months. Frank had purchased supplies for several weeks of proper eating, and as they sat by a warm fire eating beef stew and fresh bread, Emma realized that she finally felt safe again. Papa, she said as they finished eating, do you think Mama would be happy with how things turned out? Frank looked at his daughter, warm and fed and smiling for the first time in recent memory, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. I think she would be very happy, he said, and I think she would be especially proud of you for having the courage to ask for help when we needed it most. Emma smiled and leaned against her father's shoulder, finally able to trust that tomorrow would bring food and warmth in the presence of a father who was truly present. Outside, the wind still howled through the Montana wilderness, but inside their small cabin the Morrison family had found their way back to hope.